Oh, wow. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Stimulus number 4, Stimulus Connects number 4, Women, Drug Use, Pregnancy, and the State. My name is Sandra Kahan-Chu. I am the moderator of the webinar today, and I'm a lawyer and the Director of Research and Advocacy at the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network. We're a human rights organization based in Toronto, but we work in Canada and globally on a host of issues that affect people living with and affected by HIV. But before we get started, I would like to turn it over to Sophie, our incredible translator, who will give some instructions about translation interpretation service today.
Hello everyone, bonjour tout le monde. I will start in French and then repeat in English. Alors moi je suis ici pour offrir l'interprétation simultanée pendant la rencontre. J'offre l'interprétation à l'écrit, alors vous pouvez y accéder en cliquant sur CC, sous-titres en bas de votre écran. Ça va vous permettre d'accéder aux sous-titres ou aussi de voir la transcription intégrale à droite de l'écran dans une boîte spéciale. Je vais faire mon possible, bien sûr, pour vous transmettre la signification des partages de nos conférencières. Et voilà, vous pouvez aussi ajuster la taille de la police en cliquant sur CC. Hi everyone, I'm providing simultaneous interpretation during today's webinar. We're going to have presentations in English and in French. The simultaneous interpretation is provided in written form. You can access it by clicking on CC subtitles at the bottom of the screen. That will allow you to activate it or to access the full transcription on the side of your screen. I'll do my best to keep up, and thank you to the presenters for trying to maintain a slower pace to accommodate the interpretation. Have a great meeting.
Thank you, Sophie. So I'd like to begin today with a land acknowledgement. I am living, working, and talking to you via Zoom today from traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Wendat, including the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation. I feel extraordinarily privileged to be living, working, and Zooming from you here today. And as a human rights advocate and someone who fights for health and justice, I am guided in my work at the Legal Network by the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the calls to justice of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. And I think a lot of their calls to action inform why we're here today, the need to close the gap in health outcomes between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, the need for culturally appropriate drug dependence treatment, harm reduction services, mental health care, and the need to eliminate the overrepresentation of Indigenous people in custody. So I know that's why a lot of us are gathered here today, and I thank you. And I want to now move into the beginning of our webinar. Just to begin, this is the first time I'm hosting a Zoom webinar, and I'm a little bit of a Luddite, so I appreciate your patience. I appreciate everyone's patience and kindness as we go ahead with this. Our amazing Shay will be helping with some of the tech. You can see her waving right now. And Natasha from Kapud, who is, you can see her waving, she will be moderating the chat. So today we have speakers in English and French, and Sophie will be providing the closed captioning. For those of you on social media, we'll be using the hashtag StimulusConnect. If you have questions for any of the panelists, you can go in the Q&A box. So if you look in the bottom of your Zoom, there's a Q&A section. You can put your questions in there and we can upvote them, and those questions will be taken by the moderator. What we've decided in terms of this particular panel is that we would have one question to follow each speaker. So we have some time for questions immediately after the speaker, and then at the end, we'll have more of a discussion and we can have follow-up questions afterwards for all three panelists. If you want to have an anonymous question, you can change your name in your, I think it's, change your name using the drop-down option if you want to ask a question anonymously. Like I said, Shay is there to connect if you have any technical problems. The event is being recorded and will be available on the Stimulus website next week. And I wanted to send a special welcome and shout out to some international guests. I understand we have the Eurasian Network of People Who Use Drugs here, a Kenyan Network of People Who Use Drugs, and the South African Network of People Who Use Drugs, and also audience from all over the world. So thank you for joining us. Welcome. We have an incredible panel of speakers. Also, one thing I just wanted to draw to your attention, there is a link in the chat box that I put in there very beginning, about language and gender. So we will be talking about women who use drugs, potentially gender diverse people who use drugs. So if you want to check out the terminology that we're using, and so there's some consistency, you can check out that link, the CCGSD link there. I also hope we can all be mindful of the language we use today. There are people here with lived experience of drug use, lived experience of sex work, so we can be mindful when we ask questions or have a discussion. I would really appreciate that. And so moving on, this is the fourth of our Stimulus Connects webinars. One of the reasons I think I was asked to moderate is because at the Legal Network, we recently produced a report called Gendering the Scene: Women, Gender Diverse People, and Their Access to Harm Reduction Services. And this was a report that emerged out of what we found, an utter dearth of research, or like a compilation of the research that exists in Canada about women and gender diverse people who use drugs and how they access harm reduction services. There are two main things that we found in relation to women and drug use, pregnancy, and parenting. And I would just want to sort of use this to frame our conversation as we go on. And this is nothing that will be new to the speakers, but to frame our conversation going ahead. The first is that the fear of child protection involvement is one of the main barriers to women accessing any health services, including harm reduction services, pre and postnatal care, any sexual and reproductive health services. So the very fear, it's a real fear of child welfare involvement. So that is a huge impediment. The second thing that was a really a not surprising finding, but it was a really disturbing one, was the conflation of parental substance use with child neglect or child abuse. And this is seen from service providers, and what that has led to is like a complete overrepresentation of poor people, low-income people, racialized people, Indigenous people, and people with disabilities in the child welfare system. And that is a really troubling reality that we all face, and I'm hoping, I know the speakers will be touching on that today. So we will begin with our first speaker without further ado. Our first speaker is Natalie. Natalie Kaminsky has worked in harm reduction for 7 years, more than 7 years, first as a volunteer, then student, then peer, and now as a harm reduction services coordinator for Moyo Health and Community Service, an aid service organization in the region of Peel. Her work at Moyo includes sitting in the Women's Community Development Coordinator role, and from that creating the Women's Health Promotion role and leading Peel's Sex Worker Needs Assessment. In 2017, Natalie started the Peel Drug Users Network, an online community for drug users in the region to connect with one another and various opportunities where their voices need to be heard. Natalie identifies as a queer woman with lived experience in drug use, sex work, violence against women, incarceration, homelessness, and being a ward of the state. Thank you so much, Natalie, for being with us here today, and I will turn it over to you.
Hopefully folks can hear me. I'm also, I just wanted to add, I also sit on the board of directors with the Canadian Association of People Who Use Drugs. Oh, now I'm all flustered. As I was introduced, my current work is that I'm a harm reduction outreach coordinator in the region of Peel, which is just outside of Toronto. My work includes connecting with drug users in our community to get them harm reduction supplies. And previously, when I was in the women's specific roles, it was to work with women that were at risk of or that had HIV, and to support them, do some community development work with various service providers. And then moving into the sex workers needs assessment, we wanted to know how women who were in the sex industry, including obviously trans women, cis women, and folks that didn't identify as either. And so we wanted to see how people connected to healthcare services and their experiences as sex workers. And so in that assessment, we found that women that worked in the sex industry did not feel comfortable connecting to services. And actually one of the realest fears for them was the police and being called out. And for folks that were parents, that was CAS was also a massive concern. I myself am a drug user and a mother, and my experiences echoed what other women had said to me and my experiences in my work. So I'm very open about my drug use. I'm very open about my experiences And so going into hospital, I was very clear with my doctor what kind of treatment I wanted. And I thought I had chosen a fantastic hospital. And knowing that CAS would be involved based on my lived experience and everything that I had shared, I decided to do a bunch of drug testing during my pregnancy because I was going to abstain. And I found that my experience from delivery and then on was quite traumatic. And I think that's something that a lot of women share. As I spoke with women in my work, and then women in my social circles, the experiences were all very similar, where CAS was involved from the very beginning. Sorry, I'm also reading the chat. So Children's Aid Society, Child Welfare Services, I guess. We used to call them apprehension services. And so I just lost where I was going. Oh, yes. Everybody that I'd spoken to had had very similar experiences in hospital, where they were treated poorly because of their substance use, whether it was past history or current. And their experiences with CAS were quite difficult as well. And so when I came back to work after having a child, I wanted to work with women to help them manage some of those issues that they were going through. And the more that I got to know actually my CAS worker, which taught me some of the things that child welfare services were looking for, the more I thought about how we can work better with women who are drug users and maybe parenting. And so safety was the issue that was quite evident in speaking with my CAS worker. And so I thought about how we work with women in the VAW sector, so the violence against women sector, about creating safety planning. And so that was something that I also wanted to work on, but for drug using parents, about how they can create a safety plan around their substance use. So you know, planning when you were going to use, making sure that the child didn't have access to your substances. And obviously, the theory of it all is very great, but then when things like the COVID happens and you can't leave your home and get a friend to watch your child because there's social distancing in place, it's not going to work, especially for a lot of women that were disconnected from their families because of their substance use. And so, yeah, that's been my struggle in the work that I do, and trying to support the women in the field. I would like to say that as someone who has gone through that experience myself, and had a really great CAS worker, that I was still left quite frightened. You know, anytime a police car rolls around in front of my neighborhood and stuff, I wondered, was I screaming at my partner for, you know, leaving the dishes in the sink? Did somebody call CAS? And so I, as someone who would say that I'm quite stable, I have a job, I have a car, I have a house, I'm very well set up, for that fear to still be quite real for me, and for me to have to worry about, am I going to lose my child based on, you know, things like even this presentation, being as candid as I've been in some of the presentations that I've done in my own region. I recognize the power imbalances that exist for substance using parents, and then workers that have the power to take away their children. I'm not sure what else I'm supposed to say, so I think I'm gonna step back, and then perhaps jump in a little bit so that other people have an opportunity to speak. Thank you. I wish I didn't go first.
Thanks, Natalie. I don't see any questions in the chat box, but I actually have a question for you. I was wondering, like, if there are any actually CAS workers on this webinar, what are some suggestions that you can share with them to be less harmful?
So I found in my own experience that being able to have discussions with my worker around the language that she was using and how it was triggering. And my partner is someone who had his child apprehended at birth, his first child. And so when she was introduced into our lives, uh, my partner had such a reaction to CAS that he stood on the other side of our house and wouldn't come and join the conversation. And I had to negotiate and explain to her why that was, right? The trauma of losing one child. He wasn't able to have conversations, but because I was also somebody who grew up as a ward of CAS, I guess I was a little more open to have those conversations, and I was a little less scared in that sense because I felt like I could carry a dialogue with my worker. And so I would say for any child welfare workers that are working with substance using parents to see if there's perhaps a harm reduction worker or somebody that that person is connected to that could come and mediate the conversation. Because obviously, as a parent, when you're sitting in a room with somebody that could take your child away based on whether you have enough groceries in your fridge, people can have a really negative reaction and a defensiveness. And that's not to say that that person isn't willing to work with the individual, but the power imbalance has to be recognized, and you have to work to balance that out. And whether that's bringing in a family friend or a harm reduction worker or someone that that person is connected to, I think that's important, because I don't think any of the like CAS workers or child welfare workers go into situations thinking I want to apprehend. But when you have a very like a relationship that's embedded in that power imbalance and there's that conflict that's occurring, there's this tendency to say that the individual is not willing to work with CAS to manage some of the risks or concerns. And so I think that it's important to include individuals that that person feels safe with and that could speak for them, and speak for them in the way where they can correct both individuals in some of the language that they're using, or negate some of the emotional tension that occurs in those conversations.
Thank you, Natalie. And do you find that the workers are generally open to that, having another person present to mitigate that fear?
So, I mean, the women that I work with in our region, when I'm the person that they call in, I've had relationships with them for 7+ years. Some of them, because I'm from my region, and I've been a drug user since I was 14. I have relationships with from high school. We know each other. We ran around together, whatever the case may be. And so, uh, when I'm able to contact that worker and say, like, I would like to be there for that person so that I can support them and help you to be able to manage that conversation. Because, and then I will explain that there is a power imbalance and there is a defensiveness. And so having somebody be there to make them feel safe may actually be beneficial to the appointment. Otherwise, it's the same thing with when police approach somebody, right? You don't get very far when both people are on the defense, right? And so I haven't had much pushback from CAS to be able to go to 1 or 2 appointments and be able to help mediate the conversation.
Thank you. You can see in the chat box, we are tremendously grateful for you sharing everything and for the work you do to support parents. I don't see any more questions in the chat box, but we can continue the discussion after. I'm sure questions will come up as we have the other conversations. So I'm going to move on to Dr. Sarah Gander, our next speaker. Let me pull up your bio. Oops. Dr. Sarah Gander, sorry, just 1 second, is from St. John, New Brunswick, Canada, and is the clinical and academic department head of pediatrics. She is faculty at Dalhousie Memorial University and co-founded the New Brunswick Social Pediatrics Research Program. Her research interests include the social determinants of health, neonatal abstinence syndrome, and hepatitis C. She recently launched a site for the Parent-Child Assistance Program, which advocates and supports women who disclose substance use in pregnancy. She's also the clinical lead of a program designed to serve children in difficult living circumstances, particularly aimed at breaking cycles of generational poverty. Thank you, Sarah, and look forward to your talk.
Thanks, and thanks everybody for having me today. It's a huge honor to be here and so fun to be talking to such a diverse group of people. So I hope I do. I hope I do well by those who signed up to listen to this, because it's really just a little bit about my story and the recognition about how the healthcare system was really not built to serve a lot of the people that it is mandated to serve, which would include people who use drugs, and particularly mothers who use drugs. So I'm a pediatrician. I've been a pediatrician for about 13 years. I trained in Kingston, Ontario, actually, and at Queen's. And so we have to go up to Ottawa to CHEO to do some of our rotations. And I remember when I did that, the resident afternoon on neonatal abstinence syndrome, they started the talk with, you may see one or two of these babies in your career. And having trained at Kingston, we would see one or two a night admitted to the NICU with that presumed diagnosis. And then now living in St. John, I see a couple of night as well. And so it's just funny how these things kind of are different across the country. But NAS as a diagnosis is such a loaded term and comes with a lot of emotion and feeling with it, I feel. And so something that people felt was a rare event was really kind of interesting to me when I started working and started to look into and get to know these families of babies who had had some drug or alcohol exposure in pregnancy, and started looking at some of the statistics. And between 2012 and 2016, the rate of that diagnosis had increased 30%. And in 2016, we were looking at almost 2,000 babies in Canada. And so that was just really interesting to me. And so as I got to know families and got to know the literature a little bit and trying to figure out what we could do the best for babies and for moms, I started reading things about rooming in and breastfeeding and skin to skin, and kind of evolving from our very subjective, punishing type of diagnostic criteria to more of a eat, sleep, and console is what we call it now, but more of a just kind of meeting people where they were and sort of looking at the whole family. And then I got really interested in what happens before they even come to hospital, and how do we coach and support our families that are using drugs. And so that's kind of where my curiosity started. Nothing that was trained as a physician to ask those questions, but just kind of the way my brain works. And then I became a mom myself. And so I have a 7-year-old and a 3-year-old. And I remember, 7 years ago, almost 8, having a baby and realizing how it changes everything in your whole mind and your body in that moment when the baby comes out. And all of a sudden I just felt this sense of like camaraderie with other moms, and even looked at moms that were my patients differently and thought, like, what a beautiful moment to really get to know somebody and to be on the same ground with in some ways, whereas we never might have been before. And felt so vulnerable. And with my second baby, had a lot of postpartum anxiety and needed my mom a lot. And the curious brain kind of evolved to, what do people do if they don't have their mom or their aunties, or really tried to think about what it meant to have that baseline level of trauma and experience in their life. And then now they're a mom, and just thought a lot about the fear of what Natalie described before my talk. Thought a lot about how much I had observed people being treated really badly in hospital, right down to a nurse yelling across a C-section room, double glove girl, she's got hep C. That kind of talk is not unusual. And how we're learning to start to not accept that behavior and call people out on it and develop harm reduction policies. And here it is 2020, and we're still in a draft phase of a harm reduction policy in our hospital that, still you have to remind people to evolve out of some really derogatory language like addicts and abuse and kind of the terminology that's very dated and I think very damaging. So this all evolved to like having a research program, because that's kind of where you can usually get some cash to develop a program to try to support people and work with people in the community and say, like, how can we do business differently, and how can we get the voice of people with lived experience to a table and at that table being heard, so we can do business differently. And so that's kind of my raison d'etre now. In my practice and these families, and trying to keep families together, trying to figure out what we can do to support and ultimately the best outcomes for children is my big thing as a pediatrician. And I think that involves debunking a lot of the mythology around things like, what does it mean to be exposed to prescription drugs, to opioids, to heroin, to meth, to smoking cigarettes, to alcohol, and that just choosing to use substances or using substances during pregnancy is not a catch-all. And to Natalie's point, the safety and the planning and what that means for people is a very individualized thing, but yet people get painted with a big brush. And so even just starting to say things out loud, like, well, if you're going to go and visit that mom, you know, has she had her methadone dose adjusted now that the baby has been born? Because maybe she's tired because her methadone dose is 3 times what it usually is, and nobody's bothered to adjust it yet. So I'm learning every day. I learn from my patients and the clients at PCAP. If for those of you who don't know about PCAP, it's a really beautiful program that was developed in Washington State about 30 years ago in response to the fetal alcohol effects of those drinking alcohol during pregnancy, and kind of evolved through the decades of cocaine and meth and fentanyl and now kind of all the things. And it's really there to support women, and the case managers are actually prefer to be termed advocates, and are really, I think, again, what Natalie described as sort of that harm reduction ally for women, to try to make sure that they have somebody in their corner. But it's an empowerment program to really kind of launch them into getting their feet under them if they need that support, and ultimately to decrease decrease births that are drug and alcohol exposed, aiming at trying to give people their best start at life. And boy, has it ever been a learning experience about the degree of trauma that our ladies have had. We have a few dads too, which is really nice. We have 46 women whose average adverse childhood experience score is about 7.5 out of 10. Which, for those of you who know what the ACE score is, it's pretty popular now to talk about the ACE score, but you know, these are what you would think, from relatively common things like your parents are divorced, right, to being sexually assaulted, witnessing violence, and that sort of thing. And so having a score of 7 or higher is quite significant. And so just trying to realize what the story is and hopefully be part of that story in a way that allows people to reach their full potential and access services and healthcare in a way that is respectful, and then ultimately just doing the best we can for our citizens. And the research program just tries to figure out what works, and we have a promise that if it doesn't work, we will stop doing it and pivot and try to work with community agencies that are doing well. It's challenging, it's heavy at times, but really rewarding, and I'm learning a lot. So I'm very honored to be here to hopefully represent a decent sized group of healthcare providers who care and are open and want to be transparent and learn, but also are powerful. We like to think social change agents for doing business differently and really opening up to a population that requires harm reduction, consideration, and thoughts, and ultimately respect.
Thank you, Sarah. That's amazing. I have a question for you about so you mentioned you're developing a harm reduction policy at your hospital, and I'm curious about some of the sort of the practical elements of that policy that might other audience might find useful to incorporate into their own practice.
Yeah, well, it's, it's crazy because it was just like a year ago where, well, it was pre-COVID, so like people were visiting. And, I ended up having this conversation with one of the internal medicine doctors about a woman who had been admitted to hospital because she had an infection in her heart. She injects drugs, and she had a lot of visitors, and they were wondering why she had so many visitors, and those visitors were men. And, and it was just sort of this mystery cloaked in why. And I was just like, well, you guys, like, she has a job, and it's, like trying to explain things to people was just so interesting, because it's like they didn't kind of get it, or, they'd find drug paraphernalia or stuff for people to use in their beds or in the bathroom, and people were just so bothered. And wanted to discharge people out of hospital. She can't stay here if she's going to have these people in. They can't stay here if they're going to use. We have no idea how to start opioid substitution therapy in a hospital. Who's going to, it was just this sense of indulging in this confusion about something that's really relatively simple. But there wasn't really an appetite for even supervised drug use. So those were the particulars. That's a long answer to an easy question, which is it was really providing drug paraphernalia if it's needed, new needles if it's needed, Narcan training, allowing people to leave with kits when they're discharged from hospital, having just a higher tolerance level for, COVID's kind of sideswiped our whole life in hospital, but just having just a general kind of respect for what's happening. If people's income depends on how many people get to visit them in their room, there's a safety concern, but can we just sort of try to work around a few things and stuff. So there's things that people can tolerate in a hospital bureaucracy, but the simple low-hanging fruit was really paraphernalia, supervised drug use, or prescribing medications. When we were trying to house some of our very unwell homeless population during COVID to keep them safe, sometimes it was prescribing alcohol, and the health authority just couldn't get out of their own way to say, like, well, there's this, Ativan and da-da-da-da. And I'm like, or, ask them how much they need, and then that's just what they need. And that's actually easier for everybody and probably will keep them the most well. So we're chipping away at it. And I've actually been kind of impressed at how progressive it's been in a way. But again, language alone shows you where people who make policies are kind of existing as we're trying to move forward.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. There are a few more questions, but I think we will hold, like we said, the rest of the questions till the end. And I think we have you for the full 2 hours, Sarah?
Oh, yep.
Great. So we'll move on to Sandra Wesley. Sandra Wesley is the Executive Director of Stella, La Memie de Memie, an organization by and for sex workers based in Montreal since 1995. Stella's mission is to improve the working and living conditions of sex workers through both direct services and advocacy. Stella is a member of the Canadian Alliance for Sex Work Law Reform and of many other networks focusing on HIV, women's rights, homelessness, and harm reduction. And more recently, Sandra has helped create the Defund the Police Coalition, which aims to reduce the Montreal police budget by at least 50%. Thank you, Sandra. Over to you.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be doing this in French. So if you haven't already turned on the closed captioning option, please do it immediately. And I'll try to speak slow enough that the captioning can keep up. Donc, tout d'abord, je pense qu'avant de parler de grossesse et de travailleuses du sexe, de femmes qui consomment des drogues, il faut reconnaître qu'on est au milieu d'un génocide des peuples autochtones au Canada, de génocides coloniaux partout dans le monde également. et que la grossesse, la parentalité, c'est un des champs de bataille principaux de ce génocide, d'une violence vraiment extrême envers les femmes autochtones, envers leurs familles. Donc, les femmes autochtones qui utilisent des drogues ne sont pas seulement surreprésentées dans toutes les interventions, que ce soit de la protection de la jeunesse ou de la police ou quoi que ce soit, mais elles sont directement ciblées, agressivement ciblées même. Donc, on ne peut plus à ce stade-ci, avec l'information qu'on a, avec la commission sur les femmes autochtones assassinées, disparues, avec toutes les autres choses qu'on a faites pour mettre la lumière sur ce génocide, on ne peut plus se cacher derrière l'idée que certaines personnes qui offrent des services ont des bonnes intentions ou qu'une personne dans le système n'a pas de contrôle sur tout le système. On doit prendre responsabilité et faire des actions concrètes. Donc, je vous invite à penser beaucoup spécifiquement aux femmes autochtones et à leur réalité dans tout ce qu'on dit aujourd'hui. Donc, moi, je représente un groupe paré pour les travailleuses du sexe. Je suis aussi mère de 3 enfants. En tant que travailleuse du sexe, une grossesse, en tant que femme qui consomme des drogues, une grossesse, ça peut amener beaucoup d'inquiétudes, beaucoup d'émotions, beaucoup de complications dans nos vies. Donc, tout d'abord, le simple fait de travailler pendant la grossesse, c'est quelque chose qui vient avec un énorme stigma. Beaucoup de personnes qui peuvent tolérer l'existence du travail du sexe ne peuvent pas tolérer émotionnellement l'idée qu'une femme enceinte ou qu'une personne enceinte continue d'avoir des relations sexuelles pour de l'argent. C'est quelque chose qui peut être très difficile à accepter pour beaucoup de personnes, même à l'intérieur de nos propres communautés. Donc, souvent, on doit cacher notre grossesse pour continuer de travailler, la cacher de nos collègues. Donc, il y a tout ce sentiment de honte avec lequel on doit composer. Comme notre travail est criminalisé, on n'a aucun droit aux congés parentaux, au retrait préventif, au chômage. On peut parfois avoir accès à l'aide sociale, mais c'est quelque chose qui vient seulement après une rencontre souvent très déshumanisante avec une personne au bureau d'aide sociale qui nous questionne sur qu'est-ce qu'on faisait pour faire de l'argent avant et qui souvent va essayer de nous diriger vers des services qui sont pas du tout appropriés pour nous et parfois vont même nous dire non à quelques reprises avant qu'on ait accès à l'aide sociale parce qu'elles vont pas nous croire qu'on n'a pas d'autre argent ou simplement là, par haine envers les travailleuses du sexe. On a des difficultés également au niveau de l'hébergement. Donc, souvent, on n'a pas de dossier de crédit, on n'a pas de référence, on a seulement de l'argent cash. Donc, de trouver un hébergement qui est adéquat pour des enfants, ça peut être extrêmement difficile également. Donc, toutes ces réalités-là très concrètes mettent en lumière comment la criminalisation a un impact très, très direct sur notre capacité de faire des choses que toutes les autres personnes peuvent trouver le standard dans la société. Il y a également souvent des craintes de la part de professionnels ou de notre entourage par rapport à qui est le père de l'enfant. Donc, ça peut être donc toutes sortes de situations où des gens vont s'imaginer que c'est sûrement une relation violente, où on va se faire questionner parfois directement sur est-ce que le père de l'enfant, c'est un proxénète qui nous exploite et qu'on peut avoir des craintes que dévoiler l'identité du père peut amener des conséquences en termes de répression policière ou d'autres choses là, dans nos vies. Donc, il y a également souvent des professionnels qui vont pousser très, très fort pour qu'on aille de l'avant avec un avortement, qui vont présumer qu'un avortement, c'est la chose logique dans notre vie. Et c'est quelque chose qui peut être très difficile, surtout lorsqu'on se questionne nous-mêmes, lorsqu'on a tous ces doutes sur notre capacité parentale de recevoir ce genre de jugement-là. C'est quelque chose qui est très, une grande barrière là, à accéder à des services. Il faut également mentionner que pour les femmes qui consomment des drogues, pour les travailleuses du sexe, pour les femmes en situation d'itinérance, l'incarcération, la répression policière n'arrête pas parce qu'on est enceinte. On va quand même en prison. Même avec des jeunes enfants, on va souvent se faire incarcérer. C'est une crainte qui est réelle. Je pense que parfois, il y a une pensée magique chez certains intervenants que si quelqu'un est enceinte, les juges, les procureurs ne vont pas les envoyer en prison, mais c'est faux. C'est quelque chose qui est très commun. Nous, chez Stella, on visite des femmes en prison et on voit très régulièrement des femmes enceintes qui sont incarcérées. Et en plus de tout ça, évidemment, le fait de devenir parent, c'est quelque chose qui va faire ressortir souvent tous nos traumatismes par rapport à notre propre expérience en tant que souvent jeunes qui ont vécu dans les hébergements là, de protection de la jeunesse, notre relation avec le domaine médical. Et le stigma aussi de travailleuse du sexe, c'est la dichotomie là, de la mère versus la travailleuse du sexe versus la pute. C'est quelque chose qui peut de façon très interne être très difficile pour nous de gérer tout ça. Donc, tout ça ensemble, ce que ça fait, c'est qu'on a une peur qui est très, très fondée et réelle de l'ensemble du système. Cette peur-là de se faire enlever nos enfants, c'est pas une peur irrationnelle, c'est un danger réel avec lequel on doit composer tous les jours, en plus de tout ce que ça vient au niveau internalisé de nos craintes sur nos capacités parentales et de nos doutes sur si on sera une bonne mère ou pas. Donc, on part déjà d'un système qui nous met dans un grand désavantage. C'est aussi important de mentionner que ces effets-là, c'est des choses qui durent à long terme, qui durent toute notre vie. Peu importe qu'est-ce qu'on fait, le stigma de travailleuses du sexe, le stigma de femmes qui consomment des drogues ou même qui a déjà consommé des drogues est quelque chose qui va continuer d'avoir un impact. Donc, par exemple, au niveau de l'allaitement, il y a évidemment un très grand stigma par rapport à la consommation, même si on consomme des choses qui ne passent pas dans le lait maternel. Donc, cette idée qu'on peut allaiter, c'est quelque chose qui cause beaucoup de problèmes. Et c'est quelque chose que j'ai vécu personnellement en tant que militante dans le milieu de l'allaitement. Des personnes qui me respectaient beaucoup, lorsqu'elles ont su que j'étais aussi travailleuse du sexe, eh bien, tout à coup, un jugement sur le fait que j'ai allaité mes enfants pendant longtemps et des questions sur les risques que j'ai pu prendre. Ce sont des choses qui font partie de la conversation. Ça continue également à la garderie, à l'école. On peut être perçu comme des déviantes, comme des personnes dangereuses et parfois même ne pas être autorisé à aller rentrer dans l'école, chercher nos enfants. Les autres parents aussi vont souvent ne pas vouloir que leurs enfants jouent avec les nôtres. Lorsqu'on vit une séparation, la garde des enfants est un enjeu très important. On voit tous les jours des personnes qui consomment des drogues, des travailleuses du sexe, qui se retrouvent avec des menaces de la part d'un conjoint ou d'un ex-conjoint qui va prendre les enfants si elle le quitte ou si elle n'obéit pas à ce que cette personne-là veut. Et c'est réel. Donc, ça peut passer d'un travailleur du social bienveillant qui, dans un rapport à la cour, va dire « mais comme elle a été prostituée pendant de nombreuses années, elle a sûrement un choc post-traumatique. » Et utiliser ça comme point de départ pour analyser la situation de la mère. Ça peut être aussi évidemment des menaces qui sont utilisées et donc ce stigma-là va nous suivre. Il faut être 3 fois meilleure mère que n'importe qui d'autre pour être reconnue. Je peux vous donner un exemple personnel. Ma fille plus vieille, elle a 15 ans. Et elle a commencé l'université cette année, un succès incroyable, mais encore, on questionne ma capacité parentale, malgré le fait que j'ai pu accomplir ça, on est encore questionné au niveau des travailleurs sociaux, au niveau de la cour. Donc, c'est même pas suffisant pour enlever ce stigma-là qu'en tant que travailleuse du sexe, je ne devrais pas être une bonne mère. Et puis, donc évidemment, à long terme, le fait d'avoir des enfants va beaucoup compliquer notre travail du sexe ou notre consommation de drogue parce que la répression policière prend tout un autre sens lorsque le risque, c'est non seulement d'être fiché, d'être arrêté, mais aussi que ça revienne vers des conséquences sur nos enfants. Et puis, donc, cette conception-là d'être une mauvaise mère, ça nous suit partout, peu importe qu'on soit perçu comme une victime d'exploitation ou comme une criminelle qui prend des risques ou des choses comme ça. Le jugement reste toujours qu'on est perçu comme des mauvaises mères, sauf à preuve du contraire. Donc, je vais parler un peu de nos besoins en tant que travailleuse du sexe et en tant que femmes qui consomment, qui ont des enfants. Donc, la première chose pour moi qui est la plus importante, c'est la reconnaissance de nos forces, de nos compétences, de notre valeur en tant que parents. Donc, le travail du sexe et l'utilisation de drogue, ce sont des activités que l'on fait avec nos corps. Oui, parfois, on peut avoir des traumatismes qui sont reliés à ça, mais souvent aussi, ces activités-là, puis peut-être même en même temps qu'elles nous donnent des traumatismes, elles vont aussi nous apporter un sentiment de confiance dans notre corps. Elles vont nous apporter un sentiment d'être en contrôle et de bien comprendre des notions de consentement, de comprendre nos limites. Et ce sont des choses qui sont très utiles pour accoucher, pour allaiter. Et que si on arrive à reconnaître ces forces-là, on peut vraiment aller chercher le meilleur des personnes. On est aussi souvent des personnes rebelles, on est des personnes fonceuses, on est des personnes qui n'ont pas peur de ne pas suivre les normes. on est résiliente. Donc, tout ça, ce sont des qualités exceptionnelles pour des parents, d'être capable de prendre nos propres décisions, d'entendre des conseils. Je pense que tous les parents peuvent comprendre que quand on est parent, on reçoit des conseils contradictoires de 25 millions de personnes qui nous disent d'un côté, fais ça, fais pas ça, t'es une bonne mère si tu fais ça, t'es une mauvaise mère si tu fais ça. Notre personnalité en tant que personne, travailleuse du sexe, personne qui consomme, nous amène à être des personnes qui vont questionner ces choses-là et qui vont être capables d'avoir nos propres opinions si on a la place pour prendre ce pouvoir-là, reprendre le pouvoir sur notre parentalité. On connaît également très bien souvent la souffrance, le plaisir, les sensations, et puis on peut reconnaître chez nos bébés leurs besoins de base. Une femme qui consomme des drogues, elle consomme des drogues pour le plaisir de consommer des drogues et parce qu'elle a un besoin qui n'est pas répondu par autres moyens et que la drogue devient un moyen de faire ça. Donc, c'est la même chose lorsqu'on élève des bébés. Les bébés ont des besoins, ils les expriment en criant. Donc, de demander à une femme de puiser dans ses compétences de femme utilisatrice de drogue pour répondre aux besoins de son bébé, ça peut être très puissant également. Donc, il y a toutes sortes d'autres forces qu'on peut imaginer si on laisse la place à ce genre de discours-là. Que si on arrête de voir toutes nos expériences difficiles comme des choses à surmonter, comme des éléments négatifs, mais qu'on arrive à donner de la place aux choses positives qui viennent de ces expériences-là, on peut radicalement changer la perception qu'une personne a de sa propre capacité parentale et donc faire en sorte que quelqu'un peut garder son enfant, peut l'élever avec confiance et se sentir bien dans ce rôle-là. Ensuite, on a besoin de soins qui sont démédicalisés, qui sont centrés sur les besoins de la personne. Pour moi, une chose qui a été fondamentale dans comment je suis devenue parent, c'était le fait d'avoir choisi une sage-femme pour accoucher. La décision au départ, c'était simplement parce que j'avais tellement peur du système médical. Je savais sans l'ombre d'un doute que mon enfant allait être enlevé si je mettais le pied dans un hôpital, que j'ai pensé qu'une sage-femme serait plus sécuritaire pour moi. J'avais raison, ça l'était, mais il y a également toute une autre panoplie de services qu'une sage-femme ou que d'autres modèles moins médicaux de la grossesse peuvent apporter. Et donc, moi, j'encourage cette profession-là à vraiment réfléchir à son rôle et à réfléchir aux problèmes, en fait, et pourquoi ces milieux-là ne sont pas toujours accueillants envers des femmes qui consomment des drogues, envers des travailleuses du sexe. Je pense que dans ces milieux-là, on a souvent une perception de qu'est-ce qui est naturel et on met sur un piédestal la parentalité naturelle et on pense à qu'est-ce qui est toxique et qu'est-ce qui ne l'est pas. Et c'est tous des langages qui peuvent causer des préjudices vraiment énormes. Il y a également toute une portion du mouvement pour l'accouchement naturel, pour l'allaitement, qui inclut des femmes qui sont très hostiles envers les identités trans, qui ont des préjugés vraiment énormes envers les travailleuses du sexe et qui vont même militer activement contre les travailleuses du sexe. Il faut régler ce problème-là dans notre mouvement pour l'accouchement naturel et pour l'allaitement. Ensuite, on a besoin de professionnels de la santé qui vont être des alliés et qui vont refuser de collaborer avec les autorités de la protection de la jeunesse. Donc, ce que ça veut dire, c'est donc de repenser le concept du mandated reporter, de la personne qui doit absolument rapporter toute situation et d'arriver à quelque chose de plus rationnel et de plus humain. Il faut aussi des personnes qui vont physiquement refuser l'accès. Si quelqu'un vient essayer d'enlever un nouveau-né, il faut que les professionnels barrent les portes, il faut qu'ils soient physiquement prêts à empêcher cette situation-là de se passer. Il faut aussi des médecins qui vont refuser de signer des ordonnances de tests de drogue ou d'autres choses qui sont utilisées à des fins punitives et non pas à des fins médicales. Il faut aussi des personnes qui vont prescrire des drogues. Donc, surtout lors d'une grossesse, si la personne ne peut pas ou ne veut pas ou n'est pas en mesure de continuer d'avoir son revenu habituel, elle veut stabiliser sa vie d'une certaine façon pour toute autre raison, il faut qu'elle ait accès à une prescription de médicaments. Et pas seulement des médicaments de substitution, mais aussi des médicaments qui vont lui donner ce qu'elle recherche dans l'utilisation de cette drogue-là. Et ça doit s'appliquer pas seulement aux opiacés, mais également aux femmes qui consomment des stimulants, à toutes les formes de consommation dans la communauté. Une prescription peut sauver la vie de quelqu'un, notamment dans le contexte de crise des surdoses qu'on vit en ce moment. Après la naissance, il faut aussi des services comme par exemple des haltes garderies pour que si la personne elle a un moment où elle a besoin de quelques heures, où elle ne peut pas s'occuper de son enfant, qu'elle puisse facilement déposer son enfant à quelqu'un de confiance. C'est quelque chose qu'on fait déjà dans la communauté et des personnes qui sont bien entourées vont avoir cette compréhension-là avec leurs amis, avec leur famille, qu'elles peuvent déposer leur enfant si elles ont besoin de sortir pendant un certain temps. Mais ce n'est pas quelque chose qui est généralisé. Et finalement, on a besoin évidemment de la décriminalisation des drogues, de la décriminalisation du travail du sexe, de la décriminalisation aussi de toutes les autres choses qui sont criminalisées ou les lois qui sont utilisées pour cibler des personnes vulnérables. Et pour ça, on a besoin que les professionnels des services sociaux de la santé se mobilisent et soient cohérentes dans ces demandes-là et vraiment soient des vrais alliés jusqu'au bout dans la lutte pour la décriminalisation. Et en terminant, ce que je voulais mentionner, c'est que c'est souvent tentant lorsqu'on commence à s'ouvrir l'esprit aux réalités des personnes qui consomment, des femmes travailleuses du sexe, de vouloir nous percevoir comme des victimes. Donc, de vouloir sortir des préjugés, mais à la place de nous reconstruire comme des personnes qui ont besoin d'être sauvées. Et ce genre de pensée-là fait partie du système qui continue de nous opprimer. Nos réalités, elles sont complexes, elles sont nuancées. Ça ne peut pas être réduit seulement à des dichotomies de victimes et d'agresseurs, de la même façon que les réalités de nos enfants ne peuvent pas être sursimplifiées. Il faut absolument réussir à être confortable avec cette nuance-là. Et une des choses, lorsqu'on parle d'enfants, c'est souvent on a tendance à vouloir comparer la situation réelle à une utopie imaginaire qu'on invente. Par exemple, bon, j'ai un enfant qui a des parents qui consomment des drogues, je veux le sortir de cette situation-là parce qu'elle est dangereuse. Mais si la réalité, c'est que l'autre alternative qu'on a, c'est une alternative qui est aussi violente, qui cause des torts, qui est aussi problématique, il faut être capable d'évaluer la situation avec plus de nuances. Il n'y a souvent pas de solution miracle. On a des enfants souvent qui, oui, ils vont vivre des traumatismes, mais oui, ils vont avoir des conséquences à long terme de la situation dans laquelle ils sont nés. C'est justement ça le système qu'on essaie de défaire. Et c'est quelque chose qui demande, surtout de la part de professionnels, une capacité de vivre avec l'inconfort, une capacité de ne pas se croire sauveur ou de ne pas croire qu'on a des solutions miracles pour les problèmes dans la vie des personnes. Comme par exemple, si on demande à une femme une abstinence complète des drogues, eh bien, c'est possible qu'on soit responsable de sa surdose mortelle qu'elle va faire par la suite si elle essaie vraiment de suivre ces conseils-là. Et souvent, ce qu'on fait lorsqu'on offre des services à des femmes comme nous, c'est qu'on nous force à performer un rôle, soit un rôle de personne respectable où on va tout cacher, qu'est-ce qu'on fait, qu'est-ce qu'on vit, ou un rôle de victime qui nécessite de l'aide et qui mérite d'être reconnu. Et cette demande-là de nous faire performer, c'est quelque chose qui nous cause des torts énormes, mais qui est aussi une source d'inéquité parce qu'évidemment, une femme blanche qui a peut-être une éducation ou une famille ou d'autres situations sociales qui lui permettent de cacher sa consommation de drogue ou son travail du sexe et de passer pour une personne respectable, va avoir une expérience très différente d'une personne qui est visiblement autochtone, qui est visiblement noire, qui visiblement est quelqu'un qui consomme des drogues ou est en situation d'itinérance. C'est pas possible pour tout le monde de jouer ce rôle-là et c'est quelque chose qui crée beaucoup d'inégalités, même à l'intérieur de nos communautés de femmes très marginalisées. Donc, je pense que ça fait le tour de ce que j'avais envie de dire aujourd'hui. Donc, on va passer aux questions.
Thank you, Sandra. That was so powerful. That was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing and for doing it in French. I really appreciated that. We have some questions in the question and answer box. The first one from Professor Philippe Salgado. It's in French. I think we have I have a translation, but I don't know.
Do you want me to read it out loud?
Sure, and it possibly in English, or maybe Sophie will do that. Sure, yeah.
Donc, il me semble que la question de l'identité de la fille et de la femme est toujours en jeu lorsqu'elle est en contact avec les professionnels de l'aide. Ce que je dis, c'est que pour la femme, on voit un effet sur son image de soi, alors que l'homme qui consomme, qui se développe criminel, n'a pas toujours ses impacts sur son identité. Est-ce cette thématique-là un enjeu important lorsque l'on envisage d'intervenir auprès des filles et des femmes? Donc, oui, en effet, pour les femmes, surtout les femmes en tant que mères, on parle souvent, c'est dans l'art, c'est partout, de Madonna whore dichotomy. On peut être une, on peut être l'autre. Être les deux en même temps, c'est un lieu de tension fondamentale, de questions existentielles sur notre société et sur l'humanité. Donc, oui, c'est une intersection qui est très dangereuse et qui met les gens très mal à l'aise. Donc, non seulement on va justement personnaliser les choses pour les femmes d'une façon qu'on ne le fait pas pour les hommes. Souvent, l'idée de voir une femme qui consomme, une femme qui est travailleuse du sexe, mais qui aussi est une mère, ça va faire ressortir des émotions très profondes chez les personnes autour de nous, même celles qui n'ont jamais réfléchi, qui ne se croient pas pleines de jugement envers nous. Donc, puis c'est quelque chose qui reste dans l'identité de travailleuse du sexe. Une fois qu'on est étiqueté travailleuse du sexe ou femme qui consomme des drogues, peu importe qu'est-ce qu'on fait après, cette identité-là reste à vie, le stigma suit à vie. Versus chez les hommes, qu'il y a peut-être une tendance un peu plus facile d'aller vers la recouvrance et la capacité d'effacer le stigma, de se reprendre en main, de s'en sortir d'une façon satisfaisante pour la société. Et puis, évidemment, on sait que au niveau des hommes, le standard pour être un bon père versus le standard pour être une bonne mère sont complètement différents et déconnectés. Donc, un homme qui consomme des drogues, le tribunal, par exemple, va avoir beaucoup plus envie de lui donner des opportunités d'être un parent, d'être compréhensif envers ses besoins, versus en tant que mère, soit on est parent à temps plein et capable à 100% de s'occuper de nos enfants, ou soit on ne l'est pas et on n'a pas cette zone grise-là d'avoir une parentalité à temps partiel, par exemple. Ce n'est pas reconnu comme quelque chose de positif.
Thank you, Sandra. So we will open this up for more questions for all the panelists now. I just want to remind all the audience that you can put your questions in the chat box, in the Q&A box that's on the bottom part of your screen. And there's one that I wanted to share that came in earlier for all the panelists. There's a question about similarities between Children's Aid Society or Child Protection Authorities and police due to the power imbalance. Could any of the panelists speak a little bit more about the similarities and differences between these structures? Thank you.
So the question is whether, what's the difference between kind of child protection services and police services?
The similarities and the differences, given the power imbalances that parents experience facing both.
Oh, I see. I guess, I mean, I can speak from what I see with my patients who obviously don't want either group involved in their families. The police seem to have a strategy at times now where they don't want to intervene very often because they're meant to be, I think they're trying to change their perception so people will come to them to try to feel safe as opposed to feel like they're trying to interfere. I'm not quite sure how successful they are with that. But then Children's Aid, we were talking about this when we were prepping for this conference, is that one thing that I've noticed in New Brunswick is that there seems to be this mandated drug testing at times that I would argue compromises the rights of women and children for that matter, because they'll swab the children too. And after we got off the call, because I had so many questions after I left, I called one of my friends who's a social worker here and said, what kind of training as social workers working with child protection or children's aid services do you get with how to decide who to drug test and what to do with that information, and even how to interpret those tests that are largely very clinical tests that in New Brunswick are sent to the US. And so then your data is in a US institution, and all the like ethical problems with that and the compromising of people's rights. And the answer was really that they don't get a whole lot of training in it at all. And so I don't know enough information about it to judge that scenario, other than that I would have a lot of questions that I would want answered. But they say, oh, well, they signed consent. And it's like, well, it's coerced consent, really. Like, what choice do you have when a child protection worker is there looking at you saying, if you don't do this drug test, you know? So it's just it's an interesting power imbalance, in the sense that, like, we pretend that people have a choice, but do they really have a choice? And if, like you were saying, Sandra, the biggest fear is having child protection involved, then are we really giving people a chance to, you know, have a choice? And I just think choice and voice are really important.
So I think I would like to hit on this in the sense that I think neither organization is built to be person-centered. CAS, the priority is the child. And so with police, the priority is obviously upholding the law. Those are the functions they were set up for. And so when you think about being on the other end of that interaction, you recognize that neither are there to work with ensuring that your feelings are respected, and that, you know, you are treated with some emotional care. I think you don't have a choice on whether or not you participate in that interaction with either, because it will get used against you. And as a drug user, as a sex worker, as a parent in that scenario, you understand the power and the privilege that both those organizations hold up over you. And so trying to negotiate in those scenarios is very difficult, at being the other person on the end of that, right? And so I think going into those conversations is something that's terrifying. Both have the ability to change your life drastically. You know, police have the ability to take freedom, and Children's Aid have the ability to take away your right to parent. And so how can you go into either of those interactions with a sense of security and safety, right? So I think that that's something that, when I was talking about the similarities, I think the feeling of being the person on the other end of that interaction, it feels the same, because you recognize that you have no way of negotiating a scenario there.
I would add to that well, for one, I think that for a lot of people, the fear of going to prison is not the biggest fear in our life. We can manage that. We've done that. It's, you know, whatever. It's not fun, but it's not the most traumatic thing. The fear of having our children taken away, the fear of our children being harmed, that is a very powerful and enormous fear. And anyone who has the power to harm our children and taking them away is harming them, is infinitely more scary than anything else in society. And one thing that I say a lot about police is that the police are the most dangerous and scary when they have a savior mandate. So we see it, for example, with human trafficking and the way it's becoming the new way to talk about sex work, that if they feel that they're rescuing us from traffickers, well, they are empowered, they are extra aggressive in their methods, and they really take it much further. We've seen it with COVID-19, when they are saving the world from a pandemic through giving us tickets. They take a lot of liberty and they're very comfortable violating our rights because they're saving the world from a pandemic. So the same applies to social service workers who feel that they're saving children from abusive parents. It makes them do things and violate our rights in ways that they wouldn't do if they merely had a punitive approach or were just trying to punish us for being bad parents. They go home at night often feeling that they rescued people. It's why they got into that job, so that they could rescue babies from horrible parents. And that makes people very, very dangerous. And that goes back to the nuance I was saying earlier that people need to have. There's no magical solution. There is no rescuing children. There is only managing the material conditions of our lives and trying to make them a bit better. But that's not rewarding in the same way that saving a child by taking it away would be.
Thank you, Sandra. And as you know, we did a study of sex workers and their experiences with law enforcement in Ontario, the legal network, last year. And one of the biggest fears that people shared with us was not necessarily getting a criminal charge or incarceration. It was about child welfare involvement. So that was really echoed in all the people we spoke to. We've got a number of questions here, but before I mention that, there is going to be a poll that will be launched, because the topic of women, gender diverse people, drugs, parenting, pregnancy is huge, as you all know, and we can't cover everything in this one session. So we will be having another Stimulus Connects touching on some of these topics. So we'll open up a poll soon that will ask you what you think the next woman-related Stimulus Connects topic should be. And there it is. So vote, and maybe we'll give everybody a little bit of time to look at that, to vote, and then we can proceed with some questions. Okay, so people can still vote, but I'm going to just move on to the first question here we have from a nurse. And their question is, how do you introduce the idea of speaking to a social worker as a way to access resources to help with parenting, rather than being perceived as a threat to keeping their baby? So this is a question for any of the panelists, but it's not directed to any particular panelist, but if anybody wants to take a stab at that.
I feel like Sandra wants to say something.
I have a lot to say about that. Yeah, okay. So I would say that for me, one of the really basic things that I need from a healthcare provider, either for myself or when I'm accompanying someone, is I need them to explicitly and clearly inform me that they will never, under no circumstance, call youth protection, police, or any other authorities and introduce them in my life, no matter what. So I think that's a first step to build trust. And if, unfortunately, social services, the service provision part is tied to the, child apprehension part, as long as those two things are connected and come from the same system, there is just no safe way to access those services. It just doesn't exist. So the solution is to find alternative services. A lot of community organizations, like here at Stella, it's a service that we offer, that we accompany sex workers with whatever they need, including if they have needs with a new child. There are many other organizations that offer that service. But right now, those systems are just not safe. And for me, someone even suggesting that I should access those services will be crossed off as someone who's not safe to talk to, and I will never return with my children, usually.
Oh, sorry. Can I just ask Sandra a question, Natalie? That's fascinating because, like, most people in community work are legislated mandatory reporters. So nobody should ever be able to even say, I will never. You know what I mean?
Well, they should, and that's why those laws are unjust. And they're, when we talk about things being a barrier to accessing health, this is a perfect example. It's a very clear barrier that, like, it doesn't matter if the system is unfair, then people should be able to take that risk, and the risk shouldn't fall on us. The risk should fall on the person who has a position of privilege and power in that interaction. And, you know, most doctors will not lose their, you know, doctor license if they refuse to report. And if they do, then that can become the start of a conversation about this problem in society. But there are many, many parents out there who, you know, have to think through even taking their kids for basic healthcare, even registering kids for school. I have homeschooled my children for most of their education for many reasons, but one of them being that that was a way to avoid interacting with mandated reporters. So I think it's something at some point that we'll have to have a conversation and think about, you know, does it really make sense to have those mandates, and are they causing more harm than good?
Yeah, because we worked really hard to have PCAP be, I mean, it was unavoidable, because if you are involved with the community at all, the expectation is that you would be a mandatory reporter. But basically the workaround is that our advocates are never, like, they never make calls, because we don't, it's just bad for the relationship for all the reasons that you say. But it is kind of a sticky place to be in at times.
And I think part of it also is how we define child abuse, how we define imminent danger, and to maybe, if someone has to have a policy that includes mandated reporting, to be really explicit about what is and isn't imminent danger, what is and isn't child abuse, to be very clear that simply using drugs and doing sex work is not inherently child abuse, that simply talking about suicide is not imminent danger, to, you know, try to see how we can, at the very least, redefine those things to minimize the situations that that they would be invoked.
Yeah, thanks. That's really important.
So I would just like to echo what Sandra had said, and I would actually question why in labor and delivery a nurse would want to introduce a social worker in that moment. Like what was the trigger for that? Because I would say that my labor and delivery was the worst experience of my life. And it was supposed to be like a beautiful experience. From being a sex worker, I'm very in tune with my body. I was looking forward to being able to have my child, and it was destroyed by nurses hovering, social workers hovering, people asking me questions, accusing me of things. I was accused of being on drugs because I was stressed out and I was snappy. And so I would question why that's a thought in labor and delivery for a nurse to think, right now, this is the moment this person needs a social worker and needs resources, as opposed to, you know, after you have a child, you're in hospital and there's many nurses interacting with you, and there's classes happening for breastfeeding, and there's different, you know, people teaching about how to use a car seat, and why not, you know, in saying we have these things occurring, do you want some resources, or do you think you need some help with some resources? And that being when you may introduce how those resources could be accessed in different ways. But I can tell you, I felt trapped. I had an epidural, and the moment I couldn't move my feet was the moment the social worker entered my room. And I felt like I was being held hostage. And if I could have ran, I would have ran mid-labor out of the hospital. And I know lots of moms who think that they can avoid going to doctor's appointments to avoid CAS interacting. They can avoid going into labor and delivery. They'll travel to another city or another province to have a child because of that occurring in hospital, because of, you know, the way that they are treated during their pregnancy. I opted for drug testing. The moment I found out I was pregnant, I told them, start drug testing me, because I don't want my file to say that a doctor mandated it, because that will be CAS's in. And so I knew I had to abstain. I knew that during breastfeeding, I had to abstain. And I was in a good place in my life where I could do that. If I hadn't been in that place, I would have hoped that I had the information and the support around substance use and pregnancy and what's safe and what's not, or what are some tips. And that would have been the help that I wanted, not a social worker down my throat that had the power to take my baby. And I don't think the hospital's the right place for that. Not in labor and delivery. That is a private moment for mother to enjoy bringing a life into this world, and she should not be in panic that that life will be taken from her before she is done birthing it.
If I can add to this, maybe I'll do in French since I was supposed to do French. Un élément aussi, on parle souvent et de plus en plus, l'évidence montre que les premiers moments après la naissance, quand c'est là que l'attachement, il y a des moments très importants qui se forment entre le parent et le bébé. C'est là que l'allaitement, le succès de l'allaitement va souvent dépendre des premiers instants qu'on a accès à notre bébé. Donc, c'est quelque chose qui est reconnu maintenant, qui est évident, qui est clair. Et donc, il faut penser dans le contexte d'une personne qui se retrouve dans un environnement très hostile, comme un hôpital, si c'est quelqu'un qui consomme, si c'est quelqu'un qui est marginalisé de toutes sortes de façons. Ces moments-là, si notre objectif, c'est réellement d'aider le lien entre la mère et l'enfant, d'aider cette famille à développer un bon attachement et à s'assurer que la personne ait des bonnes capacités parentales, il faut prioriser à tout prix ces premiers instants et s'assurer que c'est un moment où la personne, elle est confortable, où elle se sent bien, où elle n'a pas peur de ce qui va arriver ensuite. Donc, simplement, si on se base dans les données sur le succès de l'attachement entre la mère et le bébé, ça devrait être interdit que des travailleurs sociaux, que des interventions de ce genre-là se produisent à l'hôpital ou même dans les jours après la naissance. Il n'y a pas un seul bébé à l'hôpital à la naissance qui est dans un besoin urgent de services sociaux. Il y a des professionnels de la santé qui sont là, il y a des supports qui sont là de façon inhérente à l'hôpital. Il n'y a jamais un besoin urgent à la naissance d'un bébé pour ce genre d'intervention-là. Donc, ça doit devenir une pratique médicale qui est déjà evidence-based, qu'il faut protéger ces moments-là à tout prix, particulièrement chez les femmes où il y a une vulnérabilité quant à l'attachement avec l'enfant.
Thank you, Sandra. And I think that's a good segue to what we need to do. And there's a question here in the Q&A about education. What do we need to do in medical school or residency training? And I would say that more broadly for social workers and anybody involved in child protection services related to working with families. What do we need what needs to be part of that education?
It's a slow evolution in medical education, remembering that health systems are built a certain way historically. So what I've seen happen in the Canadian curriculum is a social accountability type of mandate where over the last 15 years, they've slowly moved to try to get students out in the community, and sometimes they call it things like service-based learning, where they're in a community. So I will take students into the environments where I'm involved in community programs and things. It's difficult to do it that way because then I sort of feel like you're just bringing a student in to kind of meet people and look at people and talk to people, and then it's not a meaningful relationship, and it's not an engagement that I think benefits the people that we're trying to serve as much as it benefits the student. I think it's working towards breaking down the us and them type of philosophy and really realizing that them is us and is our community. And so for me, it's really my practices in the community. And so it's, I guess I really reject the compartmentalization of medicine where we talked about it before too, about it's the methadone clinic. Oh, I'm going to go to the methadone clinic for the afternoon. And it's really, how can we incorporate all services into where we provide people nice primary care and holistic care. And so I worry about those things because that's how the system is built, to say, well, that's the clinic for ADHD or that's the clinic for this. And nobody is just their diagnosis or just the sum of those parts. It's really about people, and I think we're moving in the right direction. We're way behind the times, and so some of this harm reduction stuff is the first time students are hearing about it is when they're actually in the real world, talking to people and listening to their stories. So we just need to get those stories into the curriculum as early as possible.
Thank you, Sarah. Natalie or Sandra, do you want to add anything? Go ahead.
I'll go. So there are many things when it comes to train. Oh, was Natalie going to go first?
Trying to speak, but she was on mute, but go ahead.
Oh, do you want to go first, or? Okay, I'll go. So I think that any question of training needs to come with policy changes. So training alone, training people to do better in a bad system doesn't really work. You need to make sure that whatever you're training, you're also changing the policy. I think that service providers need to learn how to handle emotionally difficult situations, how to handle heartbreaking situations, and to really understand what a non-directive approach means. It's something as community organizations that we do when we do outreach. The training of an outreach worker is a lot based on non-directive. Non-directive means non-directive. It means that you're not motivated by the goal of getting that person to change her life, and that you need to be able to go home and not feel bad if the person didn't stop using, if the situation didn't improve for a certain family. And I think that people get very problematic when they don't know how to handle that and they want to intervene at all costs. And finally, even though it's not the solution, it's not because it's not the central issue, but I do think that clear information on the actual impacts of drugs during pregnancy, during breastfeeding, needs to be made available as standard information. It needs to be part of, the same way that for breastfeeding, we can access these databases with every possible medication ever made and exactly what it does. And that all of that is skewed towards, if it's not super dangerous, it's fine. We want to encourage people to breastfeed, and we're like, oh yeah, there's potential risks, but the benefits outweigh the harms. Well, we need to have a similar approach when it comes to drugs, and that comes through actual information. People need to know that no, not all drugs will, have, horrible catastrophic consequences on the child. And also that we need to recognize the benefits, and that we can do an analysis of, do the benefits outweigh the harms? And the only way you can do that is if you understand that there are benefits to drugs, and that people use drugs for a reason, and that those reasons are valid and important. So I think that needs to be part of the of the training for medical professionals.
So I think that me and Sandra are quite in tune today. And I just also wanted to add that there's, when I went through schooling for a social service worker, we did an activity on privilege and understanding our privilege and our power. And they gave us scenarios of, the work that may come about in the field and how we would react. And I think that the critical part of those exercises was understanding the power we had in those scenarios and on to change someone's life, and how much we could affect the outcome and the direction in which the person experienced service, right? And so I think that the medical field in general has been extremely harmful for people who use drugs, for sex workers. I mean, as a sex worker trying to access any care in the hospital, it's it's terrifying having to be put in a scenario where you need to admit to that in order for a medical diagnosis to make sense. And so I think that examining where those harms have occurred in the past, and then looking at how things can be done differently going forward. Medicine was built on like racism against Black women, right? That's how pregnancy and all that stuff came about. And so if we think about that, where have we been able to make the changes going forward, and how can we affect the experiences people have? I think that doctors go into the work with a purpose of diagnosing, treating, and there needs to be a focus on the caring part, right? And caring isn't just the diagnosing and treating. It's the experience and it's the way that you treat folks. I mean, yeah, that's all I'll say because we have doctors on here, but I definitely think that we have to examine where some of our theories have come in medicine and practices have come from medicine and adjusting that lens now to where we are in the world now. And that's, we're doing harm reduction work. Women have a voice, and that's not where all these practices were built.
Thank you for sharing. I think that was really, really important. We have a question about from Deborah. I'm curious to know how much emphasis while educating is being put on the psychological detriment attached to the instability that is caused by a child being removed from their family. So there's a lot of like conflation of substance use with parental neglect, but how about research about the actual detriment to children who are removed from their families when there's no real evidence of neglect? I've found through research done in my own time that instability is often far more psychologically damaging to a child's developmental progression than drugs being used within the home. So any thoughts on that research? I think I'm aware of some research I can throw in the chat box later on, but to the panelists.
So I only have one thing to say about that. Whenever we're as adults, as mothers, people want to attack us and justify why we're incompetent mothers. The fact that we were raised in foster care is always used against us, and everyone knows what it means. She grew up in foster care. She's messed up. She's a bad mother. She's traumatized. She has all those bad things. So if we can recognize that that's part of the picture when we're adults, then we don't even need research to know that there's a huge impact on children that is completely excessive and probably a lot worse than those of us who haven't been raised in there. And I'd be interested maybe if research would be done on looking at mothers with similar set of lived circumstances in terms of poverty, homelessness, drug use, sex work, and those who did go to foster care and those who didn't, and to see the impact that has on us as mothers. And I think that's how we can really see the intergenerational effects of how taking a child away from its family ruins the lives and harms people for many, many generations. It's part of how Canada has decided to genocide Indigenous people.
You're on mute, Natalie.
I was gonna, again, echo that. I mean, when my CAS worker entered my life, part of the conversations we had about me being a ward of Children's Aid, and I had said to her, I find it really interesting.
Natalie, you're on mute again. I think you accidentally muted yourself.
Sorry, I don't know what's going on. I don't know how much people heard, but I'll just start again. My CAS worker, when she entered my life, we had conversations about the fact that I had been a ward of the society. And so I had flipped the script back to her and said, I find it interesting that you're here to examine my abilities as a mother based on the fact that you recognize that foster care was a damaging experience to me. And the idea that you can take a child to put a child into foster care when you, as an organization, identify that children are harmed in foster care just didn't make sense to me.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Sandra. I encourage people to put more questions in the question and answer box on the bottom of your screen. We have some comments here that maybe people can speak to if they'd like to. One of them pertains to the situation in Alberta. For those of us involved, a lot of conversation with local, I think CS as children's service representatives are pulling a lot of strings. We're all working towards the success of mothers and babies being kept with their families, so this can be a very successful approach whenever possible. The workers can work together with pregnant individuals to set them up with a list of what they want to see in terms of support network, housing, revenue, etc. once baby is born to reduce apprehension. And some children's service jurisdictions have started to work off the corner of their desk with individuals who are pregnant during the pregnancy to make a success plan to support moms when they give birth and reduce the risk of childhood apprehension. This is out of their mandate, as there's technically no child yet, hence the working off the corner of their desk. Does anybody want to respond to that comment?
Well, I think
So
that's, oh, sorry, Natalie, go ahead.
I was going to say that my CAS worker entered at 6 months pregnant. And I mean, I work in the field, right? So I had the resources that she was put in place to provide me. And so I've just found it a very invasive um, process, because I was looking forward to my pregnancy, and that instilled fear very early on in it. Um, but I do know that in Ontario, there's Campaign to Zero, which is the Children's Aid Societies looking at, by a certain year, I can't remember the year, having zero apprehension and zero kids in foster care. And that doesn't make sense. That's not a possibility, because obviously there's scenarios where children do need to go to foster care. And I wonder where there is going to be support for individuals who have lost their children prior to that Campaign to Zero, and what kind of integration is going to happen, and how families are going to be supported that don't get their children back, that were apprehended for things like smoking weed, where now it's legal, that there wasn't any interaction with the child or the pregnancy and marijuana, but the child was apprehended and made a ward because smoking weed didn't stop. And so I think that it's harmful the way that we create these campaigns to zero and have these ideas that all of a sudden we're going to change a system so drastically. The outpour that happens from that is a lot of actual harm, because up until that date, that reaching of zero, what's occurring? People are being harmed, right? And I think we've seen that in other campaigns and scenarios where we thought that we would just stop doing what we're doing, apologize, and reformat, and everybody would be okay. Well, marijuana is legal, and we still have people in jail for petty offenses with weed, right? And so that's just one of the scenarios that I'm providing. But yeah, I think that it's problematic. I don't want a CAS worker in my life early on in my pregnancy. I think there's other ways to do that. And that's let's fund harm reduction programs to support drug users while they're pregnant. Let's do that work. As a harm reduction worker supporting somebody who's pregnant, I would love to be able to give them the information on how to pump and dump after using drugs. But it's not available. And when it is available, it changes so drastically from author to author that I can't give somebody a best case scenario or a process on how to do that thing. And yeah, I think that we need to look at who's providing the help and not be funding things that have historically been punitive and damaging, because I think that they will continue to be. We need to integrate services that are specifically for drug users or specifically for sex workers and fund them to provide that support, because most of us are doing work that we are not funded to do, because we recognize that holistic view of wellness, and that somebody can't reach point A without these things occurring. And so a lot of us are doing extra that isn't funded, isn't paid for, and that needs to happen. And yeah, sorry, I'm talking a lot today.
Thank you. You're talking a lot, but great stuff. I'm also talking a lot. So what I have to say to that comment about Alberta is that I read that, and to me, what it sounds like is an abusive boyfriend saying, I'm going to beat you, but I don't want to beat you. So if you want me to not beat you, then here's all the things you have to obey, and here's how I'm going to control your life instead. And then if you do that, maybe I won't beat you, but I'm beating people. It makes no sense. And I get that people do these things with really good intentions, that they're seeing that is unfair, and I'm sure that there's a lot of, youth protection workers that have, removed children and that feel that this is unfair and not okay. But we need to start way ahead of that. And why is the notion of apprehension even part of the lives of a lot of people? You know, if a baby is not even born yet, then why is it even a part of the conversation? How is it that there's so many newborns and really small babies that somehow youth protection feels they need to be involved? It's profiling. It's targeting specific communities of women and making a lot of assumptions about the fact that we will be bad mothers. We don't do that to the average suburban mom who, you know, is not profiled in the same way. It doesn't matter. She might be on a lot of prescription meds. She might be drinking her, you know, 8 glasses of wine, you know, and joking about it on social media. She might be doing all kinds of things. She might be a really bad mother. She might be, you know, have all kinds of issues. And we're not going to intervene until years down the line, something happens that triggers a need for intervention. So we need to have the same positive regard for everyone. And we cannot just intervene because we've decided that if someone is Indigenous and uses drugs, her kid is probably going to get taken away anyway. So let's intervene earlier. Like, no. So I do respect that there are some people in the system who do everything that they can, you know, within that system, and that have convinced themselves that, you know, this is the best they can do. But I think that we can do better and we can do more. And I'm not going to applaud people for, you know, maybe not taking away a child every once in a while. Like, you know, no.
Thank you, Sandra. Thank you, Natalie. We have 2 questions in the chat box. One of them is about the ACE score. What does that stand for? The Adverse Childhood Experiences score. And the question was, what benefit does the ACE score provide or have on the women in the program, and how is that score used?
So it doesn't really offer any benefit to them, which is why we actually kind of stopped doing it, because I mean, while the research shows that the benefit of knowing your ACE score helps you better understand the circumstances by which your life has come to where it has, I guess. When they did the research on the ACE score and they interviewed people who, like, I don't know, is it fair to give a little bit of backstory about how the ACE score came about? Okay, so the ACE score loosely is like, kind of was found by accident. So researchers on the West Coast of the US were actually studying obesity and heart disease and diabetes, and they were trying to look at some of the early predictors of why some of these adverse health outcomes were happening. And one of the interviewers, the researchers, was talking to a woman about her weight and early sexual experiences, and said something to the effect of, like, how old were you when you had your first sexual experience, which people kind of societally contextualize as being maybe a consensual sexual experience or not, or a relationship. But she misheard him and thought he said, how much did you weigh? Or he may have even had a slip, but and said, how much did you weigh in your first sexual experience? And she said something like 20 pounds. And so then he was like, no, you know, when was your first sexual experience? And she was like, 20 pounds. And so then you realize that, like, 20 pounds is the size of like a 2-year-old, right? 2 or 3-year-old. So then trying to, and then all of a sudden it was this kind of research light bulb moment where they went with some of their unwell subjects in the research and looked back and realized that it was statistically significant how early their sexual experience was compared to the general population. And fast forward to trying to put together an adverse childhood experience score that then they proved sort of would predict whether or not you're going to have these adverse childhood experiences, or sorry, these adverse medical conditions. So out of 10 questions, if you have a score over 4, then you have a drastically higher chance of having these medical conditions. And so, like, I think I just noticed in the privilege and power score, healthcare providers. Okay, yeah, right. So my privilege and power score is that I have a very low ACE score. It is 1.5. And I say it's 1.5 because my parents are divorced and we all drink too much, but it's not really classified as substance use in a negative way that the ACE score was. So maybe it's just a reverse ACE score. That's your privilege score. I don't know. But the reason why we did it is a bit of advocacy, because I don't think that many of our clients, it's a big shocker that they've had a lot of trauma. I think they kind of know that about themselves. But it is to have people understand the lived experience of people, I guess. So there's actually an abbreviated ACE score that talks about what happens ongoing in life. So it's really misused, and there's a lot of data in looking at cases, so positive childhood experiences and how they actually build resilience, and that how, so if you Googled right now the ACE score and you looked at some of the questions like, did your parents drink too much or use drugs or whatever, one might argue that, like, well, what if they did? But if you had sort of a loving, affection environment, like what balances that out so you become the person that you are? And how do we measure harm? So there's a very big movement to reject the ACE score as a clinical tool, and I would be part of that movement. It's really a research tool. It's really meant to just try to understand people, but it's just kind of a pretty raw measure. But it was really interesting research because it really opened up the conversation around what it means to try to mitigate the trauma and toxic stress of children, and that is very meaningful. And a lot of literature that even can happen in utero and have effects later. Oh yeah, brain story certification. Sorry to jump in, Sandra, because that is an excellent program. I've done that. Yeah.
I think
somebody did the ACE score and they scored 9. Oh, okay.
Yeah. And I think the question was also how, you touched on it a little bit, but like, how is it used? Like, do you see it in your practice, and how is it used against women?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess I just, when you're a doctor, you kind of do have a sciencey research brain. And so I find it interesting when the kids in my practice, just by hearing their stories, I can like mentally count up their ACE score, and they'll be like in my office. Well, some babies are born with an ACE score of over 4, you know, when you really look at it. And so then you kind of, as a doctor, are trying to think like, oh, is this a higher risk person that I need to support or watch more closely? Because of that, I don't think we know that conclusion yet, but I guess it's just another piece of information is what I use, is trying to just, again, probably do what I was trained to do, compartmentalize people into a category of like, this is a high trauma situation.
Thank you, Sarah. We're closing in on 2:45 right now. So what I think we'll do is have all the speakers, all our amazing speakers, wrap up with maybe concluding thoughts. Maybe next steps would be helpful. We've talked about needs for change in policies. Obviously, I think the duty report issue needs to be interrogated, changes in practice, other things that we collectively as an audience can maybe work towards. So maybe you could start in the order that we started with, Natalie first, and then Sandra, and then Sarah, and then Sandra.
Can I think on this for a second and let other people go first?
Sure. Does Sandra or Sarah want to go next? And if you want to think on a second, actually, I understand the poll is ready to share the results if people are curious to know what the next stimulus connects, the most popular responses. It is 24% for harm reduction tools. Is that right? Yeah, harm reduction tools for parents, 24%. Great. Thank you everyone for voting. That's exciting. Okay, so Sandra or Sarah, do you feel like sharing and wrapping up with some thoughts?
Go ahead, Sandra.
Ok. Donc, pour moi, je pense que des sujets comme celui-ci, il y a une raison pour laquelle on n'en parle pas souvent dans les milieux de réduction des méfaits, on n'en parle pas souvent dans les milieux au niveau de l'accouchement, de l'allaitement, etc. C'est parce que c'est des sujets qui sont très, très difficiles, qui soulèvent toutes sortes d'émotions, et pour qui, même pour des personnes comme moi qui suis sur des panels tout le temps, je parle de plein de sujets, je représente ma communauté. C'est un sujet en particulier qui est très personnel et stressant et difficile de parler. Donc, il y a tous ces obstacles-là à avoir des conversations en profondeur sur les personnes qui consomment la grossesse, la parentalité. Mais je pense que ça devrait justement être un incitatif à ce qu'on trouve des façons d'avoir ces conversations-là le plus possible. Pour moi, en tant que personne qui a passé beaucoup de temps undercover, si on veut, dans le milieu de la fertilité, dans le milieu de l'allaitement, etc., dans le milieu des sages-femmes, où je sentais que je ne pouvais pas être out comme travailleuse du sexe. Et qui, dans le milieu du travail du sexe, je devais parfois cacher le fait que j'allaitais ou le fait que j'étais mère. Je pense qu'il y a beaucoup à apprendre si on met ces deux mouvements-là ensemble et qu'on essaye d'avoir des conversations. Fait que j'espère qu'une des choses qui va sortir de la conversation aujourd'hui, ça va être de voir des événements organisés en dehors du milieu simplement de la réduction des méfaits ou du VIH et que ce soit organisé par des milieux médicaux, par des milieux féministes, par toutes sortes d'autres milieux et qu'on soit invité à venir parler à ces personnes-là. Je pense que c'est une étape essentielle. On ne peut pas simplement avoir ces conversations-là entre nous. Il faut amener ça aussi à l'extérieur.
Thank you, Sandra. Sarah or Natalie?
I think that I'm still agreeing with Sandra quite a bit in the sense that I would love to see these kinds of discussions be integrated into other fields other than harm reduction and social service work and social work, and to see the involvement of more lived experience being the teaching points of medicine and fertility. And I think that we really do need to put some priority to get non-medicalized individuals into these areas, labor and delivery, having a mom as an advocate that's available for women that are birthing, and having somebody available in fertility clinics that can have conversations with moms and support them. I really do. I hate the word peer, but I really do see that we need to get more of that involvement of people who have lived it and been there oh good, my computer's gonna die, to negate and change the way that things are structured. I would also like to say my favorite thing when I was in school was learning about being person-centered, right, and client-centered care. And I think that we need to go back and examine whether or not we're actually doing that and how we're doing it. And yeah, I'm just going to go with the power and privilege thing, right? We need to find ways to make sure that we balance that out and take away some of the privilege and power and give it to the person that we're supporting instead.
Thanks, Natalie.
Yeah, so I mean, I completely agree. It's interesting with trying to, that I created the PCAP site here with that intention, and I think I probably drive the employees crazy because I'm never around, and I wonder if part of that is hopefully a little bit of instinct to check my privilege and to stay out of it, because while many of our PCAP advocates, well, half of them are social workers by training, the other half are not, and but there's always sort of this lean towards a clinical piece. And so we're about to hire a new person. And so, I mean, the dream is to have enough traction with the program to, like the ones that have been around for a long time that work really well, having people who have been through the program then get hired with the program is really where they've seen a lot of dramatic success and help. And so that would be my dream, is to really sort of incorporate women who have been helped by the program into delivering the program. And so that's probably my closing piece, is really, it is an enormous struggle to know how to make space for a first voice in policy change. Policy decision makers are inherently privileged because of the way the system is designed. And it takes so many generations of change. And I don't mean like life generations, but just like term generations to get new people into those seats. and not just, like I think I said when I talked earlier, not just in the seats in a tokenized way, but like have their voice heard, that we may not be able to destroy the privilege differential right away, but maybe we could start to create allies who bring those people to the table and support them, and our allies in having their voice heard. And so that's something I'd like to see really happen in medicine and even community programs. And then you don't like the word peer, Natalie, but I guess what's the other thing that we say is kind of like, well, I guess it's the experience piece, like just having people who have been there be the ones that deliver some of this information and support.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And thank you to all the panelists and to the audience for your engagement. I know being online for 2 hours is difficult sometimes, but I think we all agree these speakers are brilliant. It's so generous for sharing your experiences and expertise with us. I've learned so much over these past 2 hours, so I'm very grateful. Shay has put in the chat box, I think, a link to some resources that we have from this panel, and I think maybe we'll update them as well if there's new stuff to send. And the new resources identified today will also be in the Stimulus Connects webpage. So if you lose that chat link, it's okay as well. Oh, I guess that is a Stimulus, the link. So also, Shay will be sending a survey link to collect your feedback on the webinar so we can improve our future engagements. So thank you again to all the panelists. A huge thanks to Sandra, Sarah, Natalie, to Shay for all her tech support, for Sophie for your amazing closed caption, I don't know how you do that, to Natasha for keeping track of the chat. Also to Sam Hardiman and Linda Peters from the Her Pregnancy Program at Streetworks in Edmonton, Alberta, for helping behind the scenes, to the folks from the Stimulus National Implementation and Planning Committee, including Natasha, Donald from CDPC, Julie Soleil from AIDQ, and Kira from CSSDP, and others CSSDPers, Samantha Baglot, Charlotte Smith, Sarah Daniels, and Alexander Collins. Thank you so much. This has been such a privilege for me to moderate, and I appreciate all of you. And I hope you enjoyed the webinar, and we'll see you at the next Stimulus Connects. Oh,
thanks to Sophie for all of your work in making sure we can truly do a national event.
yes, thank you so much, Sophie. Okay.
Have a good day, everyone.
Okay, bye.